What if the biggest shift in church attendance in modern history wasn't a crisis, but a calling? Over 40 million people have walked away from church in the last 25 years, but they didn't stop searching for meaning. In this episode, we unpack the real reasons behind the Great Dechurching and what it reveals about the future of faith, giving, and connection. Can the church become irresistible again? Not through obligation, but invitation. Stay with us. This conversation might just change how you see the mission.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Next Sunday podcast. I'm here with the one, the only, Jim Shepard, and we are at the Creator House. Not the Crater House, the Creator
House, yeah.
Yeah, we love being here.
Yeah, it's great. We come down here and we shoot podcast episodes, and these guys have got a great setup. The lighting, the sound makes us look and sound better than we are.
And that's true.
Which
that's
is
true. It can't improve our intellect.
No,
but it does make our voices sound better. So they can only do so much.
Only do so much, but we love them because it makes it so easy for us to come down here and just sit down and do our stuff.
That's
and
right.
We got another one today, man. I love the topic we're on. I think I've said that for like the last 4 or 5, but I really do love the topic here today as much as I've loved the other ones, but for a different reason. So there's a book out there written by a couple of pastors, Jim Davis and Michael Graham, along with a guy that maybe a lot of people don't know, but I believe he's one of the premier sociological researchers in America, Ryan Burge. Maybe some people, he's behind a lot of other stuff that people reference. He's just the guy behind the numbers, right? He does, but he's a big part of this. And the book is called The Great Dechurching. And, I think it's one of the things, Frank, that is a big idea that a lot of people talked about when the book came out in late 2023 and in early 24, but it seems to have died down.
Yeah.
And I'd like for us to call attention to it, kind of get it back on the radar screen, because I think there's some really big, certainly there's some big findings, and then the implications of those findings, and then what do we do about all this? What do we do with this? Do we just lament and say, oh gosh, that's sad? Or is there something we can do about it? And that's what you and I are here to talk about today.
Absolutely. And I love the way that he brings in stories of real life people and their journeys of dechurching, or kind of what happened in their life and the paths they took. The young lady that went to nursing school that was full of faith, and then this happened, and how people have kind of ended up in these circumstances, because it makes the conversation more real and personal. And so I just love the way the book is structured, that it's not just the data behind it, but let me tell you stories that help exemplify and help you understand the data and how it may apply to your church or your ministry or your community. And so, speaking of, kind of the big numbers that are in this, we read that 40 million people have stepped away from the church in the past 25 years in America. That's a pretty big number.
Staggering.
So staggering number would be a great way to say it. What's the primary story of loss? What do you see in the book that kind of alludes to that and kind of speaks to that in a unique way?
Well, I think the thing I love about, and you're calling it out, the stories that they tell in there are around the various reasons why people have left. And we're familiar with them, people who have church hurt, however legitimate or not legitimate that might be, deconstruction, the politicization of the pulpit. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. There's not one big reason. But 40 million is a staggering number. Yes. Frank, let's put this in perspective. This would be the first and the second Great Awakening and all the people in the Billy Graham Crusades combined. Wow. It's barely 40 million. Yeah. Those people have walked away. And let's make sure we're clear what we're talking about. We hear about the nuns. This is not the nuns. Right. That's the people who have no affiliation whatsoever. That's a whole different group. Yeah. The people who are in church but attending less frequently than they used to, that's a different group.
Correct.
This is a completely different subsection, people who have walked away from the church completely. And there's a lot of subsets of that. So, for example, the person in an evangelical church that's not mainline has a different primary 2 or 3 reasons. Yeah. The person who's a mainline denomination person, their reasons are different. Catholics, there's different reasons in there, and Davis and Graham and Burge unpack all of this so we can kind of go, beneath the data to see who are these people and why did they walk away.
And it's
but
clear.
40 million, Frank. 40 million.
Yeah. And it's clear that we're not talking about, they're not necessarily leaving their faith or Jesus. They're leaving the church, right? I mean, so part of this conversation is there are people that are saying, hey, some have no desire whatsoever. Some of the interesting stats in there of darkening the door of a church again. They're done with church, but some of the stories and examples in there, they're not done with Jesus. They're just done with the church as it is today.
Yeah. So, and that's a really interesting piece to the data and the research that roughly half of these people are open to spiritual conversations.
Yes.
And getting back to the church. So there's a lot of hope that's in the book, which we'll get to in our conversation here. It's not just about the devastation that's represented by the statistic, 40 million people.
Yeah.
But we've got to get our heads around it. 40 million people, Frank. That's a lot of people.
So when you're interacting with church leaders, when this book first came out, when other stats and research have come out from BARDA and other studies out there, how do you see local church leaders responding to this reality in such a big way, right? So it didn't affect them by 40 million, but it affected their congregation. How are they responding, or are they numb and just trying to push through and putting their head down? How are you seeing leaders respond?
I think numb and putting their head down and trying to push through is the predominant reaction I see out there.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't even know what to do about this, right? I don't know what to do about this. Even as we watched in post-pandemic, the lament that we heard in, starting in probably first or second quarter 2021, as churches were reopening and trying to get people back, like, hey, these people were with us and now they're not. What do we do about that?
Yeah.
And I think we have to acknowledge, I don't want to over-spiritualize this, but there is certainly a spiritual aspect. And, I think we have to acknowledge that what Jesus taught us about the parable of the soils is as true now as it was then.
Yeah.
That there are varying types of soil represented by the people where the seed falls, and sometimes it takes root and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. But the dechurching thing actually introduces another piece, and that is the circumstantial stuff that happens inside of a local church context that pushes people out inadvertently.
Yeah.
Right? And that's where we have to take a long look at ourselves and so what did we do that we could have done differently that maybe these people wouldn't have left? Now, by the way, there's still going to be some exit, but some of that's on us and some of it's on them. Let's start as local church leaders to figure out how much of that is on us. Do we have a dysfunctional and or toxic culture? And if we do, how do we go about fixing that?
Yeah. I was talking to a pastor in the Georgia area or in the state of Georgia just last week, who their sermon series post-Easter of 2025 is around church hurt. They're doing a 5-week series to say, I'm sorry if we've done something wrong. I'm sorry if you've had bad experiences at other places. And the idea is that they're preaching to the room, knowing that everybody in the room has people in their lives that have been affected and have experienced dechurching and have left the church. So it's as much equipping the congregation to have conversations and apologize on behalf of the church, but then also a sermon series for them to hopefully share with those people that are hurting, to say, hey, we see you, we're sorry, we want to figure out a path forward. I don't know that it'll address all the issues, but the fact that they're willing to do that and just say, hey, we're going to try to at least speak into this space is pretty intriguing.
Yeah, and I don't know that we don't want to go deep into this today. Maybe we do an episode on some other time about it. But church hurt is usually not about the church; it's about somebody within the church.
Yeah.
Church hurt has a name, usually. And my experience is, Frank, that a lot of times a good, healthy Matthew 18 type of process could resolve a lot of this. I don't know that it could resolve all of it.
Yeah.
In my church, for example, we do have membership.
Yep.
And as an elder, I do membership interviews. One of the things that's a flag for us is if someone is coming to our church on transfer from another church in the area, not from Charlotte, that you moved here,
Sure.
But if you're in the area vicinity of our church and you're coming from another church, our first question is, Frank, how did it end there for you?
Yeah.
Not well, Jim.
Yeah.
Not well. Well, tell me about that. And then you begin to express church hurt and sort of a fallout with a certain pastor or a person over there. And then our question is going to be, Frank, have you tried Matthew 18 as a means of resolving this? Most of the time, Frank, the answer is no.
Yeah.
And here's what we do at our church. I don't know that we do this perfectly, but the intent is we would say to you, Frank, we're going to pause the membership process here and ask you to go and try to make that right with them before you come here. Reason being, what we've learned is when it comes to church hurt, what you've experienced and or maybe perpetuated somewhere else, you're likely to repeat it over here if we don't resolve that. The wound has to be healed. So don't want to go too far down that one, but but we all, the church that went too political.
Right.
I mean, we're not that far removed. As you and I record this today, we're not this far removed from our election.
Right.
And you and I both know people on the red side and the blue side who are just taking it too far.
Yeah.
Taking it too far. And people get, offended by that. And they're like, hey, if that's the church, I don't want any part of that. And that was a big part of some of the stuff that was in here. Yeah. It was the lack of community. Didn't feel like I was plugged in. Scandals and hypocrisy. The stuff that they see in the news. They don't hear about the 50 pastors that finished well, had that long obedience in the same direction that Eugene Peterson talks about. They hear about the one that did something really stupid.
That's right.
I mean, as you and I sit here today, there's one sitting out there. And it's like, good Lord, do we have to go through this again?
Right.
But people who don't know better, they're like, well, that's an indictment of the church.
Right.
And it's all those other things. And we have to begin to figure out how do we deal with that at the local church. Again, I don't want to go too far down this lane, but I think if we focus more on spiritual formation and discipleship than we have over the last 10, 15, 20 years, there are more solutions there than there are in almost any other place we would go.
That's a great observation, Jim. As you read the book, were there any stats or numbers or things that kind of popped off the page to you that was like, wow, we need to kind of double click on this or understand this a little bit more, or at least have an open conversation about it?
I think I'm quoting this right. I think the largest single, if it's not the largest, one of the largest categories of people who are out there are just people who moved and haven't gotten reconnected.
Yeah.
I think that surprised me when I saw it, and it didn't surprise me when I thought about it, right? And so, I think he says in the book, 50% are open to returning to church, quote unquote, especially if somebody invites them. I mean, I think that's that they're just hanging out there.
Yeah.
Right? So what if we did exit interviews in our church? My affinity for using giving numbers to determine pastoral issues.
Yes.
So if Frank and Jess have been giving consistently for the last 3 years in our church, and all of a sudden they stop giving, and I don't see them around regularly, I need to reach out to Frank and Jess and find out what's going on, right? Not because of the money you're not giving, but it tells me something's going on in your life.
Yes.
Hey, Pastor, thanks for calling. We've gotten a transfer. My job's gotten a transfer. We're going to be moving to Indianapolis, Indiana. And I was like, and so the next question ought to be, well, do you guys have in mind a church that you're going to attend there? No. We'd love to find a place that's kind of like this one here. Hey, let me tell you what, Frank. I don't know of one right off the bat, but I know I can find one. What if I make some phone calls and then come back with some I'd love that, Pastor. I'd love to know, where do I get started? Where do I get started, right? So we can actually, in the church, we can help to solve this just by conducting exit interviews on people who are moving.
Wow, that's really good. That's really good.
And that was a little bit of an aha for me.
What about the people that, I can't remember if this was in here or what part of the conversation this came up, of the people that were in the church that go off to college or whatever experience, find their way back to the community, but not back to the church, and nobody's got them. Nobody's pastoring. Nobody's reaching out to those people. So they kind of just fall through the cracks and find a new rhythm.
Yeah, you and I did an episode a few months ago about that. And remember what we found out? One person on our home office team is in exactly that category. Exactly that category. She's in that category. And she happens to be in my little pod, the group of people. We have put everybody in relational pods inside of Genera, so you've got 3 or 4 people that you're connecting with on a regular basis. And so when we were asking her about a pain point, she's like, well, I'm in this situation where I've gone off to college and I've come back and I don't feel like my church really sees me. I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
wow. So that's in there. That's in that group of people, right? And we talk about that in the church. Well, those people go off to college, they kind of go their own way. And like, no, some of them actually return back to the church that raised them and grew them up.
Right.
And then they get disaffected because they're like, wait, this church, it had a place for me up until the time I went to college, and now I'm back and I'm looking to plug in. I'm not married. I don't fit into any of the typical categories here. How do you pastor me? And, I think we got to do better at recognizing that and seeing that in our churches.
Absolutely.
Right? What are some of the people groups that are not being seen because they're not as prominent and not as maybe influential as others?
Yeah. No, that's good. What other things kind of stood out to you from the book that really resonated?
I think just the fact that he was so careful to go through the categories of people who are leaving. Busyness, mobility, and life changes. I think that we expected that one. That one is the one, I know there's plenty of situations that don't fit in this. I think that's typically going to be our category 3 soil. It looked like they were with us. It looked like they were on mission and on point with us. But the cares of life, the busyness of this life got in the way and just choked out the word. And, it could be any number of things. It could be leisure. It could be kids' activities. One of our friends, well known, he said, the number one enemy to church attendance on Sunday mornings for young families is club ball in America.
Right.
He just says that out loud. He just not, and he's like, hey, my kids played club ball, but that's getting in the way because they orient a lot of their stuff around the weekends, and Sunday morning is where, if your kid makes it to the championship, that's when they're playing, Sunday mornings. And Burge and Graham and Davis called that out here. So that wasn't a surprise when I saw that. I just didn't realize the category was as big as it was.
Yeah.
Right, in terms of that. So I think it was just really, for me, if you had asked me why the Great Dechurching would have happened, I would have had maybe one or two reasons, but there were more than that. The layers and kind of the nuance in some of those things.
Yeah.
But then again, that whole 50% of these people, I think it was 50%, large category, just out there because they moved and can't get reattached. Bro, you know this and I know this. We live in isolation right next to our next door neighbors.
Yeah.
And that's getting in the way of the church being the church.
So I have this thought from a pastoral care standpoint that who's got them? Okay. So if you know somebody's leaving your church for a bad reason, good reason, whatever, they're moving, I wonder, maybe this is irrational, maybe this is unnecessary, I don't know. But I think about it through the lens of college students, but it could be anybody. If you know somebody's moving, just because they're out of your proximity, does that mean they're out of your pastoral care? And I wonder what would happen if we felt a responsibility that for 1 year, every family or young adult that moves away from our church for a job or whatever, we do a monthly check-in. Somebody from their small group or Bible study or somebody on the team just call, or a text message to check and see how they're doing. Have they found a church? How did that church visit go? Things like that until they can get in and under some other pastoral care. Right now, I think we think if they're not in our community, they're not our responsibility. And I just go back to that idea of who's got them. If it's not you, who's got them? And we can't be reliant on, well, hopefully they read a great Easter promo or see a great Easter promo video or Christmas promo video, and that draws them into my church now that they're in my community. Who's got them?
Yeah. So when Nancy and I became Christ followers back in 1983, spring of 1983, Palm Sunday is when we gave our lives to Christ. The church we had started attending assigned a couple to us. Never forget them, Mike and Star Scott.
Okay.
And they were our big brother, big sister.
Yeah.
It was like the church put the hound of heaven on our tails. And both of us had been raised in the church, and we felt so much shame and so much guilt over having, not really having been a part of the faith and all the dumb stuff we'd done over the years, me in particular. And Mike and Star didn't care about any of that, man. They just loved us so much and so unconditionally that it was irresistible for us to become a part of that family of faith right there and begin our early spiritual formation. So what if the backside could look like that as well? We assign to you a big brother or a big sister who becomes your mentor, as it were, your exit pastor, whatever you want to call them, for a 1-year time frame until you get reconnected.
I just think that's wise. I don't. Maybe there's a point where you just can't from a scale standpoint. But let's start with the next 12 families that are young adults that move away. Let's just say we're going to start an arbitrary number. Mm-hmm. The next 12, we're going to make sure they land at a good place.
Yeah.
And we're going to start something new.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth it.
I think the other issue for me, Frank, is, and I've talked about this from several different perspectives, but we've got to do something about the winsomeness of the body of Christ in America, especially in America, maybe around the world, but especially in America. Because specifically in 2020, my take on it is that we as a church in America, the church, now I know there were plenty of exceptions, the church in America didn't really look that much unlike the unchurched, didn't look that much different than the unchurched people in America. Mm-hmm. As we reacted to racial reconciliation, as we reacted to COVID in the church, as we reacted to the election of 2020. I mean, there were people in my church and in my friend groups that put stuff up online, Christ followers. Yeah. And I was like, dude, if I was a pagan, I wouldn't put that up there, much less a Christ follower.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to think that, and then you put it up there. Right? I mean, that's just not. I mean, we can't do that. Yeah. It's like, I mean, you've heard me say this, that the He Gets Us campaign. I get, pun intended. Yeah. I get the point.
Yeah.
I get the point. Yep. They're trying to say, this Jesus that you think you know is not the one. Let us show you a different perspective on that. My problem is that if you respond to the ad, and the church was your problem, if we don't fix the internals, you're going to go back and meet the very same people that you were repelled by in the first place, and you're going to be back out there, and it's even worse now because you're out there a second time. So that's what I'm saying when I talk about, we've got to deal with the winsomeness of the church, which is a discipleship issue. It is a deep formation issue where we don't have the need to react to every single thing that comes out there.
That's good.
Should you have a point of view? Yes, you should. Do you need to express it every time you see an opportunity to do that? No. Filtering is not a bad thing. That's a sermon that I preach to myself all the time. Filtering is not a bad thing, Jim. Just because it comes to your mind doesn't need to be said. You've heard my thing. It's like there's the bubble over my head and what comes out of my mouth. That's and right. my struggle right now is keep the bubble over my head from coming out of my mouth, because that's the unfiltered part, right? And so I feel like the dechurching really does have that embedded in it, that we do have to be more winsome. If you go through the issues, for example, you go through some of the stuff. So of the dechurched evangelicals, the cultural, that was one category. He talked about that in chapter 4. They left due to life busyness, convenience, or a gradual drift. They're still open to church, but they require relational entry points. Yeah. Right? So that means as a friend, I've got an opportunity.
Say it again a little slower. Quote that again.
So they're still open to church, but they require relational entry points. Yeah. That's kind of what he said. They're open, but somebody's going to have to invite them. They're not going to go there on their own in all likelihood.
That's right.
They're going to have somebody invite them.
Jim, you and I, before we recorded this podcast, we swung by Chick-fil-A to have some breakfast. Yeah. And then we went to Starbucks because I needed a latte.
Are they sponsoring our podcast? We should get some sponsor dollars here.
That's it. Keep
going.
We go to Starbucks, and you're like, if you want to waste your money on that latte, that's fine. I'll sit over here in the corner. And so you're sitting there waiting on me. I get my latte. I come sit down, and a gentleman walked over from a church that we know and love. He saw a logo I had on a shirt that I was wearing, and he was like, wait a second, that feels like a connection. So he come over, and he immediately started talking, and he loved his church. Whew, man. Average guy, great guy in his congregation. It didn't take long to figure out. This guy loved his church, was so excited about some of the things they had coming up, and he was filled with joy. And here's what I would say. If he would have walked up to any table with that posture and that passion, I think many of the people at that Starbucks would have been like, I've got to go see that for myself. I'm intrigued. That sounds different than my past experience. that doesn't reconcile with things I've heard about the church or experienced with the church. There was something about the way he was carrying and celebrating what God was doing through his church and his pastor that was really special.
Yeah.
And so I think, to your point, that relational opportunity is there. And if we really have connected with a body of believers that we're thankful to be a part of. We, in my church, we have Bible studies, but they're closed. Like, they're only open a couple times a year. So you have a Bible study, you're with a group of people for a period of time before you can invite new people. And so there's room for a relationship. There's different philosophies on that. But I'll tell you, our hodgepodge group of guys right now love our group and are very vocal about it. And they are excited about when we open back up and can invite some of their friends that they're praying for right now. And I think they're more likely to come to that than to see an Instagram post to maybe come check out my church. You know, it's that relational connection, to your point, that just has incredible power. Yeah. And I think the dechurching talks a lot about falling out of relationship, falling out of community, moving away, and then just kind of finding a new rhythm. Those things are very real challenges that are out there, sometimes because of hurt, sometimes just in transition, and somebody's got to step up and just be willing to share the gospel. And so mobilizing our people to do more than just invite to church, but to be passionate about the gospel and about the church would be helpful.
I didn't think about it till you mentioned it just now, but that Starbucks was pretty crowded this morning.
It was hopping.
And I wasn't looking around, but what if somebody overheard? Because we were not quiet. It was pretty, shocker.
Shocker.
Jim was there and it wasn't quiet. Hey, Mrs. Shepherd, you know, Jim is loud. Yeah, we know that. He's loud at home too. So sorry about that. It's first grade, back then. But what if somebody's overhearing?
Yeah.
The three of us talking about a church that this kid loves.
Yeah.
And that we love because we know the people there.
Yeah.
The two guys that lead the church. We know that. And just to hear that and like, whoa, I might want to go check that church out.
Absolutely.
Right? Wouldn't that be cool if heaven showed us that someday?
Yeah.
Right? But he was so effusive. I mean, he sought you out.
That's right.
Hey, bro, I go there too. He named the church. I go there too.
Yeah.
Didn't know we were from out of town.
Yeah.
And we just happened to know that the senior pastor and the executive pastor. It's like, it was so cool.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. Another thing that was interesting, Frank, is, I enjoyed chapter 8, which was really dealing with the African-American church.
Yeah.
Much lower walkaway rate than everybody else. Much lower, right? It's this sense of community and this cultural identity that they have, right? So I thought that's fascinating. Didn't necessarily surprise me, but I'm like, never thought about that, right? Because they identify as a group. They've got a closer connection community-wise. I mean, a lot of that is just through historical perspective and all the other things that they share. But I was really intrigued at that, in chapter 8. And he spent some pretty good bit of time talking about that.
I think the book, if you'll read it from cover to cover, there are these insights and things that we can all learn in leadership and in our churches that could have significant impact in the way that we serve a lot of people that have found themselves away from the church, separated from the church.
Yeah.
There's power in that. And I think we've got to be disciplined to go seek that out and learn and get better, and not just anecdotal statements about the one thing that was said that one time, but some substantive data that helps gain some insights. And this book does that for me.
Yeah. I think the helpful piece for me, one of my things is about any kind of a book that illuminates a concern, something is like, okay, it's one thing to point it out, but let's not just point it out. Can you point us in the direction of what could be done? And part 3 of the book really does that. Kind of the what can be done about this. In chapter 10, he talks about how do churches respond, move away from performance-based models. People don't want to see that stuff anymore. Embrace deep community and hospitality and emotional health and value those things. It shouldn't surprise us that churches pastored by people like, Glenn Packiam and Rich Philotis, who are advocating this healthy pastor model, that those churches are winsome and people are flocking to those churches. It doesn't surprise us, because they see something there like, I want some of that. And then talking about the role of church leaders, that humility and repentance and honest leadership, as opposed to arrogance and better than you, politicization, scandals, all the other things that are repelling people. What if we can lift up those models? If people can see those kinds of leaders, that those are the ones who are saying, hey, I know what you read in the papers, but for every one of those, there's 50 guys like this and women. Right? and then just talking about what it looks like to do evangelism in a post-church age. I mean, those are really good, helpful steps forward that I think that Davis and Graham and Burge put forth in the book. So
I agree.
Yeah.
I look forward to continuing to explore these type conversations. Just make sure we're pointing leaders to resources that are helpful and substantive insights along the way. So thank you for wrestling with this. Thank you for bringing some great insights today. It's been another good episode of the Next Sunday podcast. We'll see you again real soon.
next Sunday.
Heyo. Dechurching doesn't have to mean the death of generosity. It's an invitation to rethink how we build relationships, share vision, and foster engagement in new ways.